Okay, now we are on air.
It is.
Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Community Hangout. Pardon? Okay. We are very close. We have one issue left for 212, which I think is what we're going to talk about today a little bit. And then we can maybe look at some new features if we still have a little time. Here, I'm going to quickly share my screen.
Well, remember, David, we talked about the new format.
So those are the two issues that are still there.
David?
I have nothing.
Okay. I don't know what you're saying, but remember, the new format is we're going to go through a little introductory example every time to do a little learning session in the beginning.
I got nothing. Yes.
What?
If anybody has something they want to talk about.
I said I would prepare something, if you remember.
That's fine, but I did not
prepare
have time
something
to prepare what I want. Okay. Bad planning on my part then. We're going to go over the 212 stuff last. Sorry. Then I'm just going to hand it over to you.
Okay. All right. So let me share my screen. Let me know when everybody can see it. Hopefully everybody can see it now. Okay, so yeah, we're gonna start trying a new format with these meetings. In the very beginning, we're going to try to do a little introductory either API example. Spend 5-10 minutes just showing how to do something. And then because right now I just prepared all of the CanJS meetup material for Can Component, I figured I'd give the hello world of Can Component to kind of describe how it's used. So here I have a very basic application that's loading jQuery, CanJS, and I've also included CanStash, even though I don't think I'll be using it in this example. And I'm just going to simplify this a little bit. I've got my code, and I'm going to have a mustache template. And I'm loading and rendering this mustache template.
I don't see your code. Am I the only one?
You don't see my screen?
I see your screen, but I see the Google+.
I think you just shared the Google+ window.
Oh, okay. Thank you, guys. Let me try it again. I did. Thank you. Okay, now do you see my code?
Yes.
Okay, so let me start over then, and we'll just cut that whole segment out. I'm going to show how to use the hello world of Can Component. And for my beginning of my app, I've just loaded jQuery, CanJS, and Stash, even though I don't think I'll be using it here. And all I'm doing is loading what will be a template. For right now, I'm just going to have it say hello world. I'm loading a template, the app template, and I'm going to render it into the out element. So if I reload my page, and I open this up, it just says hello world. Now, what I want with Can Component is it provides custom behavior on custom elements. So I want a hello world element, and I want to add rich behavior to that. Just by putting in the hello world element, nothing really shows up. But if I inspect my page in any browser except for old versions of IE, hello world will just show up. In IE, you have to use HTML5 shiv, and Can Compute will do that for you automatically. But in most browsers, you'll just see hello world. It has no behavior. It's not a component yet because we have to define a component for it. I just want to show people how we can tell that there is no component. So here, if I do hello world, let me make this a little bit bigger. If I do get the hello world element, which I can do with jQuery, just like you can with a normal element. I can try to see if it has a scope, which is really the view model of a component. If this was a CAN component was initialized on this element, it would have a scope. But in this case, it's undefined. So I haven't actually, the CanJS hasn't hooked up a component to this element. But we can change that by doing CAN component, extending CAN it a tag that matches the element tag name we want to add functionality to. So here I'm going to do tag hello world, and then just by doing that, this is defining the component, it will automatically be initialized on anytime a hello world is found in a template. So I'll refresh, I'll do hello world scope, and now it finally has a scope. So that means there is a component there, it's just not doing anything yet. To make it do something, say, for example, say hello world, I'm going to add a template property to this component. And if I give it a, I'm just going to make it have an h1 that says hello world. And when I refresh, it says hello world. The template is always rendered directly within this element, so if I had like something else inside there, it will be replaced. So it doesn't say goodbye, right? And our DOM just looks like hello world with an h1 inside of it. But I can position the source content, this is kind of the light DOM if this were a web component. I can reposition that with the content element inside the template. So I can say content. Put the content, whatever inside here, and reposition it with this. The template could almost be considered the shadow DOM. So here I'll refresh, and it says goodbye world. Now, if the user didn't provide anything, I can actually provide a default, but I'll show what happens if the user doesn't provide anything. It'll just say world. But I can provide a default if there is no source or light DOM content. So I'll say, hi world. That's a template property. The scope property is really the view model of the component. This is the data the template gets rendered with. Actually, when you define it this way, well, I'm going to make it a CAN map. Whoop. Typically, this is a CAN map. And let's say I wanted the scope to be a, I have a message on it. I'll make that howdy. I'm going to write the message here. So the scope defines the data. Typically, like almost always, a CAN map. It defines some CAN map that this template is going to be rendered with. So here, it's going to say howdy world. Now, what I can also do.
Wait, why is it saying howdy world? Oh, because you're not defining any content. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, because I'm not defining any content, exactly. Now I'm going to have an event. There's also an events object that can listen to events, although you can use the in-template declarative event bindings where you kind of write out things like can-click and some method to call on your scope. There's also an events object you can do the same kind of stuff with. Here, if I wanted to listen to anytime someone clicks the component, an event handler, and I can access the scope object. So I can do this dot scope dot after. I'll change the message from howdy to goodbye. Someone clicks it. Oh, this dot scope after message. Now, people typically don't define the scope as a single instance. The reason is because each hello world would then share that same instance of map for its state. What that means is if I were to click howdy world on one, it'll change goodbye world on two, because both of these share this exact same instance. Now, to change that, there's two ways you can do that. The first way is, instead of define an instance, define a constructor function, a map constructor function that will get created every time a new hello world is created. So to do that, I could do a hello world. Sometimes what they're called. To that. So I'll just say what was in here. So now this is defining a hello world view model whose default message value is howdy. And if I provide that as the constructor function, a new instance of this map will be created every time hello world is created. So now when I click, they're independent. There's a shorthand for this, which is if an object is provided, it's assumed to be the prototype definition of a CAN map. So if I just take this object here and then pass it here, that's pretty much the exact same thing as I was doing before. So can we get the same behavior? And finally, I want to show that you can pass data. Actually, I'm going to change this to use stash, because that's kind of the new way going forward. Let's say I wanted message on one of them, instead of being howdy, I wanted it to be hello. I can say message equals hello, and this is how you kind of pass data from kind of the outside world, from the kind of the template, into, and this changes the property, in this case the default property of message, to hello instead of howdy. So when I refresh this, one will say howdy world, the other will say hello world, but they both work the same.
Hey, Justin. Would you mind explaining, like, is there any need to use the at anymore?
There is not with stash.
With stash, okay.
No. So that's it. That's my hello world. And I'll try to, someone at Bitovi or myself will try to put one of these together for every one of these every week. So, Dave, if you wanted to continue on with like news and issues and things like that.
We'll actually only have 2 issues left. I'm going to share my screen. 2 are left. This one is actually just running the tests. Brian, do you quickly want to talk about this? Is Brian still there? No? Okay, well,
hey, David, why don't we talk about some of those like more controversial posts, like issues, like one, the Josh's semantic, I forgot the word he used, basically being able to
Scoping?
Yeah, scoping, not past the or lexical, yeah. Not past the. And then normally you go into a gene store. Pull that one up.
Yeah, where was it? No. This one? So you walk that winter, and it's like
So which issue is that? It's
issue 1069. I haven't looked at that one yet. What's the idea?
So yeah, let me Let me share my screen to just be able to walk through it real quick. So the crux of it is, and he has a very good point with it, is that a component's source, actually kind of an interesting way of doing this, I just thought, but a component's light DOM, so kind of what's inside the component that the user provides. I still like using the word user. Greeting should be what's kind of rendered in the scope, right? They shouldn't know necessarily that hello world has added its own greeting that overwrites essentially what the template was rendered with, because they would have the expectation that greeting was their greeting, if you will. So, you know, to which I pointed out there are some use cases where you definitely want access of what the component is providing in the user in the user DOM or light DOM, right? For example, I might have an application that adds all these nice helpers like link and has kind of attribute properties on its scope that I want to be able to access and use internally to the component. So we kind of talked about it a little bit. I think he's in an issue, but I think we need to make it, well, one, we can't change the default behavior. I think it should be optional. Another thing I was just thinking is, while I was looking at this example, is we could probably change the behavior also, that these things are still provided, but the scope lookup would read, instead of reading with the component provided first, it would read what the kind of is in the user template first, meaning that a greeting passed here would supersede the greeting within here provided by the component scope. So that way you could still kind of access your thing. I think in some ways maybe that should be the default behavior. The only conflict would be that when you have undefines and things like that, like if you try to write, you know, if they wrote greeting and like subject or something, and then you, by not providing a subject, were expecting subject to just not even show up because you didn't provide a subject here. A subject would still show up, but I think that might be a that's probably so rare that people would want that I think that's okay to have the default, but I think we should still have options to configure kind of any behavior that you want. I don't know what those options look like. If people, you know, I wish Josh was on this call, but that would be, you know, that would be useful.
What about, we talked about having like exposing methods, I think we talked about in a future version. What about if like we expose properties too, and that kind of becomes the component's, you know, external API, and those properties can be used within the user DOM, but everything else would not.
I think that there's properties that are available in the template might be different than methods and properties that are available on the element. I don't know if one could say necessarily that those things would always be the same. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, but the whole point is that you, in the user DOM, you want to access those properties, right? Is that you want to say, oh, I want to pull the greeting out and put it here, I'm accessing the component's greeting.
Yeah.
So if you expose those as like in some way, however we define that.
But again, like I think that there's some way of exposing that is fine, but I'm not sure that because I want to be able to write greeting in here is the same as me having a greeting property directly on hello world. Maybe, I don't know. Part of me feels like those might be two different worlds you're kind of operating in.
Right.
But it's you know the part of the other issue is that our approach for adding things to an element is not like it's not just adding everything on the scope. You have to kind of manually put things on the prototype of an object to get that to happen. So I don't know if like I feel like a lot of times you're just going to want a simple configuration that's everything on the scope of Hello World, make that available internally, where that wouldn't exist in the what we're doing on elements. Elements you've got to like purposefully prescribe a method, and then that is available. I don't know if that makes sense. But like
it does.
Yeah,
I feel like I like it to be explicit.
Yeah, I mean, you might like it for a time.
It's kind of the whole private versus everything public kind of thing. It's the same deal.
I tend not to. I've not been burned too many times with that.
Right. I mean, I almost always pass in properties through attributes. I don't really do this kind of thing that often. Maybe I should, but I don't really do it.
You don't read things in the
no.
From directly from the component.
Right.
I do that like I was saying, I do that all the time with
Hello.
Like an application component.
What are other frameworks solving this some other way? I mean, if we looked into that.
Are we talking about the lexical thing?
Yeah.
They pretty much are going for lexical semantics. Like all of them, pretty much got on the same page about that. That they talked about this at the web summit that I went to. You know, all the heads of all the major frameworks were like, yeah, lexical semantics are what we want here.
So you missed this, Josh, where I was. One thing we could do as like a happy medium would just be to give higher precedent to what's in kind of the user's scope. So what I was saying is that if you had like greeting would first look to this greeting before it went up to this greeting.
But the scope one is higher.
What?
The scope one is more recent in this case with the dynamic lookup. Sorry, I'm sorry. Carry on. I'll let you talk.
But you can change that, is what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
You can make it so that your user, you still have available anything that the component provides, but you're going to you're giving first, first read goes into what you are consider like the more natural your user. We need better terminology. This kind of like what Hello World's context was. You would look in first in that before you would look into actually the new context that is internal to Hello World.
So, kind of philosophically, but in a practical way, the issue, the bigger issue at hand here is that we're talking about kind of a violation of separation of concern. So you have this component that users of that component aren't supposed to know anything about its internals.
Unless they want to know what it provides and use those things it provides.
That's why the component has an external API, and that external API has its attributes. It might process its internal things in a custom way that's well documented, but to have, to have things leak unintentionally and surprisingly is I think very surprising to users. It would be very surprising to me to do that. And I think that there can be more explicit APIs for doing this kind of stuff. We can have things. One thing that.
But you can't do this. I mean, if you want to provide the user DOM a way to like position some element that the component, some attribute of the component, you can't do that through attributes. I mean, you have to do something like this. I mean, how else could you do it?
So you can provide elements inside that are meant to be filled in. Another thing, what
I don't know what you mean.
Polymer. So what Polymer actually does. So I mean, for example, you could have a tag there that's just like div class equals put the greeting here, right? And that would be the component's API. You could replace the.
Maybe you should share your screen so you can write out what you're.
Let me open.
He's saying use content select in order to do this.
No. I mean, like, can someone link me that issue again? Let me see if I can find it.
It's 169 or 1069.
Fiddle. That's what I was looking for. Is it this? So there is a space for, in some cases, where you really want to provide, like, if you want to make it a tag, the content tag available. Sorry, the counter tag available inside or whatever. Wait, where's my screen? Oh, there it is. Okay. Share my screen. Screen share this. All right, so let's talk about the counter. I want to. I think the counter example is interesting because what I would do is I would just have counter, right? And that is just gonna get displayed. 1, 2, 3. So that's one solution to the counter instead of having counter.
When you say counter, what are you talking about? Like,
you mentioned a counter example, right? Where you have a counter that start at 5, and then every time you click it, it increases, right? Let's say
when did I talk about this counter example?
There was some example where you wanted to do something like that.
Okay.
I think it was in that issue, was it?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
You can just do this. So this is an example of, you don't need the curly. You can actually, the component itself can just fill in itself with the counter
but
value.
But you wanted to provide your own, like, maybe I wanted it bold, maybe I wanted it italicized, like.
Yeah, that's very easy. You just do that, which is how you would usually do these things. And there you have it. So in this particular case,
in this case, but what if counter was multiple variables, and I wanted to put like a comma versus a colon between them, or like it was a fraction thing, and it would. Do you know what I mean? Like at some point it breaks down. Like it's just a single value.
At that point, you can say style it's shadow DOM. I mean these are. I'm trying to go with specific cases here.
Okay, so then let me give it like a fraction one. Let's say it was fraction. Like I would be able to pass it a number, like some decimal point, and it was this like fraction component that would give, it would provide two numbers. Like I forgot, it was like numerator and denominator or something like that. And I wanted to be able to style the numerator and the denominator.
Well, you can do that one of two ways. If you want to expose them as DOM, if you want to style them, just CSS into them. You can there's shadow DOM, there's API.
I wanted to change like the comma or something like that, or versus a colon that separated them, or a forward slash instead of a colon.
I mean, that solves that issue. It
doesn't really. I mean, then you have to create 2 other additional components and then somehow wire up their scope so that they themselves get access to fraction. Where it would actually be kind of tricky because numerator in this case, would that get fraction? Would that be able to talk? How would that talk to fraction through? It wouldn't be able to talk through the scope if we're changing the scope so that it does have lexical semantics, right? Because that would be the user provided, unless somehow, like, I guess I don't know how that would work.
This happens inside Shadow DOM. It's because there's the components. The Shadow DOM is selecting these different elements.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be custom.
You want to do the Shadow DOM, yeah, but that's that.
You can also do the
How does it
div class.
Yeah, you could just make them just regular divs.
You can whatever your API, but the idea is to be explicit. Now that said,
so the only
from
way,
the real world,
I guess
Polymer provides a custom renderer API, so you can actually have this work if you want to, but the standard case is still lexical. Like I think that I think the lexical semantics do lead to kind of like better structured code in general. And I think they'll lead us to using components in, I'd say, a way they're meant to be used, which is these isolated things, and they have APIs, and you go through their attributes and their children, and that's how you communicate with components, based on the content that you put into the light bomb, without having to worry about these internal things kind of just, you know.
But I guess I do think there's a whole class of components where you really just want to get behavior into your kind of into your light DOM because you're wrapping it with a component.
Let me think. I mean, I was going through when I put up that patch, I went through all the tests, and you can actually, the ones that weren't trivial to port, you can look at the flag that I added.
The tests might not be. It's not the tests that that. I guess that has little to do with, I guess, the point I'm making, because the tests aren't written to be like exhaustive in terms of use cases.
No, but they actually provide a number of common examples.
Yes, they provide examples. Yeah, they provide the examples that they test examples that I wrote the can component around.
Mm-hmm.
But having used can component quite a bit, and like there are a lot of cases where I've wanted this behavior. I'm not saying it shouldn't be what you're suggesting should not be the default. I'm suggesting that there's a need for like the existing behavior, especially for
who would control that default? Would the component allow that?
Yeah.
So right now the patch that I sent in actually has a flag that switches semantics over to dynamic. So you can always say.
What's the flag called?
Oh, I don't remember. I just came up with some name. Where's I need to pull up the patch to see it. Issues.
Naming's the hardest part.
Yeah, I mean, 2 hard problems in computer science: cache invalidation and naming things.
There's 3.
What's the third one?
Off by 1 errors.
CanJS issues. This is 1069. Oh, I need this. Cool. That's the flag.
Dynamic content.
Was that on static or on the prototype you would provide that?
This is on the prototype.
Oh, okay.
And you can see it in, here's the example. Tag, dynamic content binding is true.
Yeah, I think we'd have to play with that name.
Yeah, I mean, it can be. I wanted to get the functionality, so there we go. So here's an example of wanting to leak things out, and that's fine. But the tree combo was fine being lexical.
Of course, yeah. So would tabs, so would most of the examples in there. But that's because those were written as like, what as like what web components should be, right? They're written explicitly to be able to put a tree combo or a tabs in the page and just have it work.
So I think this is a good example. So
that is an example, yeah.
I think a lot of cases when we have stuff like this and the dynamic bindings seem like the right thing to use. And my hunch, what I'm proposing here is that what we actually want is to make it easier to communicate through the DOM when you're using components, to make it easier for people to tell components what they want the components to render by putting stuff in the light DOM and having the component react to that. And I know there's some limitations to that as far as mutation observers go, but I think that in general turns out to be kind of the general case solution for the same problem. So instead of having to make sure, having each items and then giving the items to your component, you simply render the items in your light DOM, and the component takes that as its data.
But how could you get the light items if this component is used to actually, like, in this case, the component is retrieving and providing the items? Maybe, I can't remember. I think it does. You provided a deferred, so it does actually. You don't actually have access to the items in your light DOM, so you have to have the dynamic bindings.
Well, that's what I mean. Like, maybe this should actually be done in the light DOM. Like, why is grid doing this? Like, I can render this in the light DOM just fine and just put it inside grid, and grid's job is not to fetch it, it's to display it.
But you don't have items. Yeah, no, but grid's thing is, like, I wanted a grid that handles the showing loading and not showing loading and like swapping things out. That was kind of the point of this grid. So if you want a grid that kind of helps you with that, then I mean that's not unreasonable. And then it kind of breaks down the you would need dynamic bindings for that. You would need some kind of hook to say, okay, well,
why would you need dynamic bindings?
Because the actual items is something that the grid component provides. That's in the grid component scope.
But could you just provide the row here and then the grid does the each for you, or is that you don't want that?
You could provide the row, but I don't know if that's gonna, like, sometimes that falls flat on its face. Like, if you have weird groupings or do anything other than just listing the row, like Brian and I have worked on apps before where it's like, you'll have a bunch of rows, but maybe the far left column has the same name a bunch of times, and we just actually won't even write out that name. So because it's kind of like grouped by name anyways. So if you provided each row, well, I guess you might be able to, but you still have to always do a transform on the resulting items that the grid gave you back. Now you could provide some method that would do that transform as like a hook. So you'd provide items, and then you'd provide your compute that returns deferreds, and then you'd also provide some like transform function that would like clean it up so it was ready to be rendered. But either way, that's just, to me it's much easier to just say, hey, we're going to provide you items inside your user light DOM, and you can do with what you may.
If that's like limited and explicit, then I think that's okay, but I think it would need to be an extra that the component provides, not be like a common behavior. Like I don't know if it should be a common expectation to
But how do you know this? Like, if I'm using your component, how do I know if I get this or not? That's me. It's really confusing.
well, I mean, if you're using my component presumably has some kind of documentation.
Yeah.
The main thing I'm trying to avoid is this and this.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, we need to figure out why there's a space there, but that's a separate thing.
What?
There's a space here, and I don't know why, and I need to remember to put up an issue about that. See? There's no space here. There's a space over here.
That's weird.
It's weird, but that's a separate issue. That's a minor thing. Before I forgot.
Make sure you create an issue for that.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to avoid is if I have no idea what the actual implementation is,
Gotcha.
I don't want this to happen. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree with you about that.
So as far as what use cases there are for dynamic binding, I mean, I like dynamic binding. It definitely has its place. Dynamic binding is incredibly useful. For example, when you want to like control these big parameters that are pretty global, and you want to scope them somehow within a certain area, that's great. But I found this kind of behavior kind of I think this could cause some very uncomfortable conversations if I'm trying to help someone.
Now, let's say you turned on dynamic binding. Do you still do you think though that it should be changed, the precedent to what I was kind of suggesting it should be changed to, which is you still would first go after, like your first lookup would still be on your kind of what was provided to the light DOM, and then it would look inside the scope. In some ways, you're adding to the bottom instead of the top when you render the when you're rendering the light DOM in the case of dynamic.
In which case, scope basically becomes defaults if it's not present. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's reasonable, actually, yes.
And that
when
way,
I think of the cases, so if let's say you have something to notify. I don't know. I'm trying to think of an example. Like I can think of I can think of uses for. Let's say Lisp. The way Lisp uses dynamic bindings is you can have like streams. You have streams so standard output. Set a dynamic variable, and you can say so that binds standard output to my string stream, and then you can like print foo. So print foo is then going to try and write to standard output, but standard output is currently. So in order to do stuff like this, I think the semantics that you said are what you would need to do.
Yeah, I wonder if though we'll need to give someone the ability in like Mustache to just say, who cares? Give me what I want explicitly.
So what I think we could do I think we could have the shorthand dynamic binding, but I think we may want to provide a general purpose. Here's your light DOM. Give me the output function. So that, like, I think a component could have an API that's like a renderer for light DOM. So it'll figure out how to basically it'll figure out what this returns. It's a function that takes the default content, it takes the light DOM, and it takes the So I'm gonna see if I can sketch it really quickly.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. That's
the project I'm working on.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and then you could do all of these and anything. Like you could provide any templating language in here, and you can have can components that extend like can EJS component or whatever can whatever component, and then it'll use that function to render content. But internally, it'll still use our templating engine for this part. So this is still your can component API, but as far as your user API goes, this can be anything. And we can implement the dynamic flag, the dynamic scoping flag on top of that.
Yeah, we somehow have to it kind of already works that way internally. Like you actually can make use EJS. It just will not. It'll just the whole EJS thing will be past a scope, and it won't be like there's no like scope lookup. But you can actually render an EJS template inside of a component if you wanted.
Yeah, but you can't
you can't do scope lookup though. Yeah. Okay. So, I guess to kind of move on, I would just say let's figure out what that flag is. Get it named, and then for now it's going to have to be default to true. But then we can have it. People can set it to false, and then we can flip the switch in 3.0. And then in 3.0, we should also flip the switch to say that, well, the current behavior is now, you'd have to set that to true, but then also the current behavior, you're going to kind of swap the order of the lookup. We probably do need to start creating a major branch, because we are starting to collect enough things breaking API changes that it's probably worthwhile starting to work on them a little bit. This might be a good candidate to make the change in a minor because it's a new feature, but then also fix major so it works the way we want it to eventually.
Oh, here we go. That's the API you want. I think if you have this, you have everything you need.
Yeah, I think instead of hookup options, it should be called like tag data or whatever. But
yeah, I mean, I'm just referring to that option because you want that scope. Where that scope is really.
Well, I'm just that hookup options is actually tag data. Like that's what the callback of CanView CanView tag is. Okay, so all right, I think that one's settled.
Cool.
Was there another?
Justin, you need a gavel to it's settled.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me share my screen. So I think there was another one, but Thomas isn't here to talk about it. It was just the getter syntax one. This was basically right now the define getters don't work like you would expect. They work. The reason is because one, everything with that form basically it's like a very simple getter where you would say, oh well. I know what the kind of current value is of some property, but I'm going to always adjust that when someone does a getter on it. Now, that exact same behavior can be done with a setter always, of course, because then your setter just always, when you're setting the value, you just change it to whatever the value that the getter would be doing. And that's actually typically a better way of doing it, just because you're not doing a mutation of the data every single time there's a get. You do it once and it's done. But it can be useful to situations where the number of sets is much greater than the number of gets. But there's a problem with like how asynchronous setters work when there is no observable value. They never like will actually like recall themselves. So it doesn't work that way. So we'd have to figure out a way to make a compute like say, hey, you've just bounded the value of this compute, but we didn't actually see an observable. So every time you read that compute, it doesn't matter. You're not going to use the computed value. You're just going to recall that function every single time. Fixing that should fix the problem and make it so we can have a more like the type of gets that people would probably expect. And then also the get documentation isn't fully filled out. We need to improve that. It doesn't actually show the asynchronous use at all. Was there any other kind of big issues that?
I've got a smaller one. This is not as critical, but it could be good to get a ruling from Mr. Gavel. This noisy dev warnings one. You and I were talking about it a little bit, Justin. I removed a bunch of dev warnings that were really repetitive and not useful.
Fine. Do you wanna share your screen?
I just linked the issue.
Yeah, but no one. Okay.
Anyone watching will know that.
Yeah. We're trying to turn this into Crossfire. These hangouts. Got to keep it entertaining. Here, I'll share mine.
So what's the issue? What is the issue exactly?
So the issue was, well, there was just a lot of extra noise in the dev warnings that were added over the last couple minor releases. Mm-hmm. So there's a couple things I think that are non-controversial. Construct.extend warning was showing up like potentially hundreds of times per page. The mustache key warnings were super noisy. They were wrong in several cases. They were showing up for all the helpers. Anytime you accessed a helper, it thought it was a missing property lookup, so it was shooting up a warning. And then there was, for every key that was missing, so for example, if you're in a for loop and there was like a missing key that was added later, so if you render a template without a property, just a missing property, and then later that property gets added through live binding, that property missing warning was being printed n times through the loop, so I just made it so that it just shows once. So there's just a few kind of non-controversial ones, and then the only one that I think, Justin, you disagreed with was that number 3.
Yeah.
The reason that one changed is mainly because number 3 was basically as arguments to a helper. If something was missing, it was showing up. It was showing a warning there too. And the main reason for that was just the way to implement fixing number 2 and 4 required getting rid of that number 3 as well. This is actually a few weeks ago, so I don't remember the details anymore. So I think getting more granular warnings there would take a little bit of extra work.
Yeah, but that's probably worth it because I mean the whole point is to warn people if they put something in wrong. Is it possible just to have our logging system in general just say, okay, well this just ignore by default duplicate warnings? Like if the text map, we just keep a track of every single one. If it's already been shown up, are there log levels, David?
Yeah, there's log levels.
So we could just make the default one just if it's the same thing ever gets again, it's just going to be ignored. So to me, that's not bad. I don't know how often people are passing values that are not even in that aren't properties yet. One thing we should check and just make sure of, are the helpers, if I pass a value that's like null, does it give a warning or it shouldn't?
Yeah, it gives a warning.
Okay, it shouldn't. It should only give something for undefined.
Yeah, right now it's for everything. And I mean, the problem with this is that a common use case is you render a component before the data is ready, and then the data is there. So that's
but if you wanted the warning to go away, you can just put nulls on your scope, and it would go away if you really want it. And then you're at least like being a little bit more declarative with your kind of scope description, because you'll see all these nulls. So it's like, oh, those are properties on the object. I guess I don't mind that, because if we're going to, hopefully, I mean, if someone comes and is like, hey, look at this example with all of those things kind of fixed so it's not doing duplicates, and then is like, oh, hey, here's an application and there's like still 50 errors, then because people are constantly passing arguments that are undefined temporarily and then become defined, then we can like look at ways of fixing it, you know? Maybe it's possible to do a timeout and nice.
Sorry about that.
Maybe it's possible to do a timeout and just like, you know, collect and see if an error, you know, see if that compute doesn't eventually have a value, and then if, you know, 3 seconds pass or 2 seconds pass, then throw the warning.
Yeah, that can be. I mean,
it's a compromise if we need to.
That could remove some of the noise.
Yeah, but I would say for 3, I think that we should try to keep in, or just limit it, try to make it better, but not remove it. Where's my gavel?
So I mean, the problem with that, like, it's almost makes the warnings unusable. The warnings are currently unusable.
Yeah, but can we fix it so that the warnings are usable and not remove that, I guess is what I'm saying.
Okay, I mean,
they're
it's
happy.
It can take more work.
Yeah, but we're not afraid of work. Huh?
I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think this is an improvement over what we have that I think should make it into 2.1.2, and then we could spend more time on those optimizations that you just pointed out for like 2.1.3 or 2.2.
I don't know if I agree with that. I would rather spend like an hour. It probably won't take more than like an hour or so to make it so it's a little bit better. I'd rather spend a little bit more time to try to get it to work before just removing it.
Just the arguments part, that's the thing you're hung up on?
Yes.
Okay.
Or just show me an app that's like, here's 100 places that even if we remove the duplicates and things like that, it's still going to be just like too many warnings. Show me that, and then I agree.
That's Stan's app.
Yeah.
That's where it came from. I mean, basically they couldn't upgrade to 2.1 because of this.
You could upgrade without the development mode if you needed to. But then fine, just have them show it to me, because otherwise I want to see what can be done before we just like remove what is going to be a useful. Let's just make sure there's like useful features for people who are just starting, which those would be, and there's there's annoying things for people who are like experts like us. And in general, I prefer to favor the person who's just starting CanJS and making things a little bit easier than the person who can just switch off dev mode or just is smart enough to just or make dev mode able to, maybe we can have an ID for the warnings, and there's a way you can tell dev mode like you can with JS hint, ignore warning number 5.
Okay.
I just don't want to make things harder for like beginners, basically.
All right. Let's move on. This isn't that important anyways.
Any other ones? David, I saw your can view mustache should be eliminated. I agree with that.
Yeah, I don't know if you're going to still put that in 2.1.2 or if you're going to just move it to the next one, which is going to be fairly soon too. I think we should get 2.1.2 out before, like as soon as possible, which is today, and then just fix those things in the next patch release.
Okay. I'm
So
fine with that.
I think that's it for this week.
Cool.
Nobody else
Awesome.
has anything?
No, so hey,
Cool,
hey
thanks.
Brian. Well, sorry, Brian. We talked last week about us going to do a little kind of 5-10 minute intro training exercise for each one of these every week, going in kind of seniority or start date order. So you're next week.
Okay.
That's cool. I think Mikhail's going to be after that, and then Alexis, I think, is the order.
Sure, I'll do one.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Perfect. Till next week.